February 22nd, 1986, 6:15 p.m. Ferdinand Marcos stood at the window of Malacanang Palace, looking down at something that had never happened in his 21 years of power. 2 million people surrounded his fortress. Not soldiers, not politicians, not revolutionaries with guns, just people. Ordinary Filipinos holding yellow ribbons, rosary beads, and flowers, and leading them wasn't a general or a senator or another strongman. It was a housewife. A woman who had never held political office, never commanded an army, never even given a public speech before her husband's death. Corazon Cory Aquino, the widow who had just declared herself the rightful president of the Philippines. 4 days later, Ferdinand Marcos would flee the country in disgrace. The most powerful dictator in Southeast Asia, defeated by a woman whose greatest political experience had been organizing charity events. This is the story of the most unlikely political battle in modern history, the dictator versus the housewife, and how the housewife won. To understand how Cory Aquino destroyed Ferdinand Marcos, you need to understand what she was before August 21st, 1983. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't the activist. She wasn't even particularly interested in politics. Cory Aquino was exactly what her enemies would later call her, a housewife. Born into the wealthy Coango family, she had married Ninoy Aquino in 1954 when she was 21 years old. While Ninoy built his political career, Cory raised their 5 children, managed their household, and supported her husband from the background. During Ninoy's 7 years in prison under martial law, she visited him regularly, carried messages between him and opposition leaders, and kept the family together. But she never sought the spotlight. She never gave interviews. She never made political statements. Even during Ninoy's 3 years in exile in America, Cory remained in the background. She organized Filipino community events, helped her husband with his speeches, and managed their household in Massachusetts. When reporters asked her about politics, she deflected to her husband. When opposition leaders wanted to meet with her, she suggested they talk to Ninoy instead. Cory Aquino was the perfect political wife, supportive, loyal, and invisible. Ferdinand Marcos couldn't have been more different. For 21 years he had been the center of Philippine politics. Every decision went through him. Every policy bore his name. Every photo showed his face. He had built a cult of personality so complete that the Philippines seemed unimaginable without him. But by 1983 that cult was cracking. The economy was collapsing. International allies were distancing themselves. Opposition groups were becoming bolder, and most dangerous of all, Ninoy Aquino was planning to return from exile and unite the fractured opposition under his leadership. That's why Ninoy had to die, and that's why on August 21st, 1983, Ferdinand Marcos made the decision that would ultimately destroy him. He ordered the assassination of his greatest enemy. What Marcos didn't understand was that killing Ninoy Aquino wouldn't eliminate the threat he represented. It would transfer that threat to someone far more dangerous, his widow. August 31st, 1983. 10 days after Ninoy's assassination, Cory Aquino stood beside her husband's coffin as 2 million Filipinos lined the streets of Manila for his funeral. She had never spoken to a crowd before. She had never led a political movement. She had never even wanted to be in politics. But as she looked out at that sea of yellow ribbons and tearful faces, something changed in Cory Aquino. She realized that her husband's death had made her something she had never chosen to become, a rebel. Not a symbol of opposition politics, or democratic reform, or constitutional change. A symbol of something much more powerful. Ordinary people standing up to extraordinary evil. Over the next 2 years, Cory Aquino slowly transformed from symbol to leader. She didn't seek the role. It was thrust upon her by millions of Filipinos who saw in this quiet, religious woman everything that Ferdinand Marcos was not. Where Marcos was arrogant, Cory was humble. Where Marcos was calculating, Cory was genuine. Where Marcos ruled through fear, Cory inspired through hope. Most importantly, where Marcos represented power, Cory represented powerlessness. And in a country where most people felt powerless, that made her the most powerful person of all. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. Cory began by attending memorial masses for her husband. Then she started meeting with opposition leaders who came to pay their respects. Then she began accepting invitations to speak at small gatherings. Each time her message was simple: Ninoy died for democracy, and his death must not be in vain. Ferdinand Marcos watched this transformation with growing alarm. He had dealt with male opposition leaders before. He knew how to intimidate them, buy them off, or eliminate them. But Cory Aquino presented a different kind of challenge. How do you attack a grieving widow without looking like a monster? How do you discredit someone who doesn't claim any credentials? How do you defeat someone who seems to have no ambition except justice for her dead husband? Marcos's intelligence apparatus tried everything. They spread rumors about Cory's mental stability. They questioned her qualifications. They suggested she was being manipulated by communist forces. But every attack backfired. The more they attacked the grieving widow, the more sympathetic she became. The more they questioned her qualifications, the more people identified with her as an ordinary citizen forced into extraordinary circumstances. By 1985, Cory Aquino had become what Ferdinand Marcos feared most, a unifying figure for the opposition. But she still wasn't a politician. She still had no desire for power. She still wanted nothing more than justice for her husband and a return to normal life. That's when Ferdinand Marcos made his second fatal mistake. On November 3, 1985, appearing on American television, he announced snap elections to be held in February 1986. He was confident that with control over the election machinery, the media, and the military, he could defeat any challenger. The elections would prove to the world that he still had the support of the Filipino people. But Marcos had miscalculated. The opposition didn't field their usual collection of ambitious politicians and fractured parties. They did something unprecedented. They united behind the one person who didn't want the job. Cory Aquino accepted the opposition nomination. Not because she craved power, but because millions of Filipinos begged her to run. Not because she had a political agenda, but because she represented something more powerful than any agenda: the desire for simple decency in government. The 1986 campaign became the most extraordinary political contest in Philippine history. On one side, Ferdinand Marcos, the most experienced politician in the country, backed by the entire apparatus of the state, armed with unlimited resources and 21 years of accumulated power. On the other side, Cory Aquino, who had to be taught how to give a campaign speech, who had never run for any office, who admitted she knew nothing about economics or foreign policy or military strategy. It should have been no contest. It was no contest. Just not the way anyone expected. Everywhere Cory went, massive crowds appeared. Not the usual paid political rallies that marked Philippine elections, but spontaneous outpourings of genuine enthusiasm. People came to see the woman who had suffered what they had suffered, who represented their hopes for a better future. Her campaign style was unlike anything Philippine politics had ever seen. No grand promises, no complex policy proposals, no attacks on her opponents. Just simple, direct appeals for honesty, justice, and change. She spoke like what she was, an ordinary person talking to other ordinary people about their shared experiences under martial law. Ferdinand Marcos, meanwhile, campaigned like what he was, a professional politician defending a political system. He boasted about his achievements, attacked his opponent's qualifications, and made elaborate promises about future development. Everything he did reinforced the impression that he was part of the problem, while Cory represented the solution. But Marcos still controlled the election machinery, and on February 7, 1986, Election Day, he demonstrated just how completely he controlled it. The fraud was massive and blatant. Ballot boxes were stuffed. Vote totals were changed. Opposition poll watchers were intimidated or barred from counting stations. In some areas, more votes were reported than there were registered voters. Most shocking of all, the fraud was broadcast live on television. When the official counting agency, Comelec, began reporting obviously fraudulent results, its own computer operators walked off the job in protest. On live television, they announced that they were being ordered to falsify the results in favor of Ferdinand Marcos. But instead of accepting defeat quietly, Cory Aquino did something that no opposition candidate had ever done before. She declared victory and called for massive civil disobedience to protest the stolen election. This wasn't a call for armed revolution. This wasn't a military coup. This was something far more dangerous to Ferdinand Marcos. A housewife asking ordinary people to simply stop cooperating with his government. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos took to the streets in what became known as the People Power Revolution. They didn't carry weapons. They carried flowers, food, and yellow ribbons. They didn't attack government buildings. They surrounded them peacefully and refused to leave. Ferdinand Marcos found himself facing something his 21 years of authoritarian rule had never prepared him for: a revolution led by prayer groups and housewives. On February 22, 1986, the crisis reached its climax. Defense Secretary Juan Ponce Enriel and Vice Chief of Staff Fidel Ramos, announced they were withdrawing support from Marcos and recognizing Cory Aquino as the legitimate president. But instead of ordering the military to crush the rebellion, something unprecedented happened. Soldiers began defecting. Not to another military leader but to the housewife who had promised to restore democracy. By February 23, 2 million people surrounded Malacañang Palace. They didn't storm the gates. They didn't demand Marcos's head. They simply stood there, holding candles and singing religious songs, waiting for him to acknowledge what everyone could see: his time was over.
Inside the palace, Ferdinand Marcos faced the end of his world. For 21 years he had been the most powerful man in the Philippines. He had controlled armies, commanded governments, and shaped the destiny of 54 million people. Now he was trapped in his own palace by unarmed civilians led by a woman who had never wanted to be a politician.
On February 25, 1986, both Ferdinand Marcos and Cory Aquino held separate inauguration ceremonies. Marcos in a nearly empty Malacañang Palace. Cory in front of hundreds of thousands of supporters at Club Filipino. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Marcos, surrounded by a handful of remaining loyalists, looked like what he had become: a dictator without a country. Cory, surrounded by the largest gathering in Philippine history, looked like what she had become: the choice of the Filipino people. That evening, as crowds continued to surround the palace, Ferdinand Marcos made a phone call to the White House. He spoke to Senator Paul Laxalt, a close friend of President Reagan. The conversation was brief. Laxalt delivered a simple message from the American government: cut and cut cleanly. At 9:05 p.m. on February 25, 1986, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, along with their family and closest associates, were evacuated from Malacañang Palace by American helicopters. 21 years of authoritarian rule ended not with violence or warfare, but with a helicopter ride to exile. The next morning, Cory Aquino walked into Malacañang Palace as the new president of the Philippines. The housewife who had never wanted power now held more power than any Filipino leader since independence. But perhaps more importantly, she had proven something that Ferdinand Marcos never understood. In a democracy, the greatest power doesn't come from controlling armies or accumulating wealth or intimidating opponents. It comes from representing the hopes and dreams of ordinary people. The battle between Ferdinand Marcos and Cory Aquino wasn't really a battle between two individuals. It was a battle between two ideas about power. Marcos believed power came from above, imposed by force and maintained through fear. Cory proved that real power comes from below, granted by consent and sustained through trust. Ferdinand Marcos spent 21 years building an authoritarian system designed to make him irreplaceable. But Cory Aquino replaced him in 4 days with nothing more than moral authority and the support of the Filipino people. The dictator who had survived communist insurgencies, military coup attempts, and international sanctions was brought down by a housewife with no political experience and no desire for power. It was the most unlikely victory in modern political history. But maybe it wasn't unlikely at all. Maybe it was inevitable. Because Ferdinand Marcos represented everything that was wrong with Philippine politics: the corruption, the violence, the abuse of power, the treatment of the country as stolen property. And Cory Aquino represented everything that was right about the Filipino people: their decency, their faith, their resilience, their refusal to accept injustice as permanent. In the end, the contest between Ferdinand Marcos and Cory Aquino wasn't between a dictator and a housewife. It was between a system and its people, and the people won. Today, Ferdinand Marcos is remembered as one of history's most corrupt dictators, a man who stole billions while his people suffered in poverty. His regime is studied as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and authoritarian rule. Cory Aquino is remembered as the mother of Philippine democracy, the housewife who restored freedom to her country, and proved that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they stand together for justice. The woman who never wanted to be president became one of the most important presidents in Philippine history, not because of what she accomplished in office, but because of how she got there. Through the power of moral authority over political authority, of people over institutions, of hope over fear. February 25, 1986. The day a housewife defeated a dictator. The day democracy triumphed over authoritarianism. The day the Philippines proved that real power belongs to the people, not to those who rule them. Ferdinand Marcos fled into exile that night. He died in Hawaii 3 years later, still plotting his return to power, still believing he was the victim of an American conspiracy rather than the natural consequences of his own actions. Cory Aquino served as president for 6 years, then voluntarily stepped down when her term ended. She spent the rest of her life as a private citizen, returning to the simple life she had always preferred. The dictator died dreaming of power. The housewife died having surrendered it willingly. And that, perhaps, tells us everything we need to know about the difference between them.